Thank you all so much for coming. It's really exciting to be here in the Bay Area to begin with and to be surrounded by so many fabulous friends. I feel very honored and to meet some new friends and make some new friends. And the Bay Area and the mission in particular, I think, feels like exactly the right place to be releasing the book, as it is being officially released today. A neighborhood and an area so committed to issues of social justice. It feels right, and a home to me, wherever I happen to lay my head. I also want to thank Modern Times, because they're amazing and a great bookstore, a great independent bookstore, and so generous and nice to host me. So thanks to everyone at Modern Times. I thought it was important just to situate Diego Garcia to start, so I brought along a nice map. Diego Garcia is smack dab in the middle of the Indian Ocean, halfway between Africa and Australia, 1,000 miles from the nearest landmass. Few people know about Diego Garcia, and that's part of the impetus behind the book, to tell a story that so few people know. Luckily, I suppose for me, in a slightly perverse way, the Indian Ocean is suddenly in the news of late. We hear about pirates in the Indian Ocean. And in many ways, this is a story about piracy in the Indian Ocean, piracy of a different kind, and the creation of what is another Guantanamo, another base like the base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. It's the story of the creation of a major U.S. military base and the expulsion of the indigenous people of Diego Garcia and the surrounding Chagos archipelago. What I'm going to do is talk a bit about the book and my research, and take some questions in the middle after I go over some of the history, and then talk a little bit more and read some from the book, and then hopefully take some more questions and have a discussion, and love to hear your thoughts. So some know Diego Garcia as a major U.S. military base, one of the most important strategically in the world for U.S. military officials. The base has been a major launch pad for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Contrary to the repeated denials of the Bush administration and British officials, the base has been identified as one of the more than 24 CIA black sites around the world where terrorist suspects are held and detained and possibly tortured. Finally, last year, U.S. and British officials acknowledged that, contrary to their former denials, that people have in fact been held there. Far fewer know that to create the base, the U.S. government, in conjunction with the British government, it is British territory, forcibly exiled the entire indigenous people of Diego Garcia and the Chagos archipelago, people known as the Chagosians, 1,200 miles away to the western Indian Ocean islands of Mauritius and the Seychelles. The expulsion took place between 1968 and 1973 in a process that I'll describe in just a second. I should just back up and explain a bit about how I came to be involved in the case, in the story. And that was through lawsuits that the Chagosians were bringing and have been bringing against the U.S. and British governments to gain the right of return to their homelands and proper compensation for their suffering in exile. And part of what I'll describe is the ways in which the Chagosians' lives have been deeply impoverished in exile, like other groups who have been forcibly displaced. They have lived lives, on the whole, mired in deep poverty. Some know Mauritius and the Seychelles as exotic tourist destinations. The Chagosians' lives are far removed from the tourist beaches and luxury hotels of Mauritius and the Seychelles. They're generally living as the poorest of the poor, the lowest of the low, as marginalized outsiders in exile. But in the summer of 2001, almost 8 years ago, I got a phone call one afternoon from one of the lawyers representing the Chagosians, and they needed an expert witness to conduct research to document the ways in which the Chagosians' expulsion has affected their lives. And that led to research initially for the lawsuit, but very quickly I realized there was a bigger story I wanted to tell. I wanted to understand why the U.S. government and its officials exiled this entire group of people, who at the time numbered 1,500 to 2,000. And I wanted to understand why we have a military base in the middle of the Indian Ocean in the first place. Why do we, in the minds of military officials, need a military base in the middle of the Indian Ocean? And that led to the book, which is, in effect, a two-pronged story. One part telling the story of the Chagosians and their lives both before and after the expulsion. The other part telling the story of the US government officials who orchestrated the expulsion. And the larger story of the empire that the United States has become, and the ways in which Diego Garcia can help us understand something about that empire. As I'll discuss at the very end, the book also focuses on the Chagosians' struggle to return to their homeland, and through lawsuits and other means, which I'll come to at the end. Let me start by talking a little about the life of one Chagosian. I focus on one family of Chagosians as a way to explore the experience of the Chagosians as a group. Her name is Rita Banku. I'll pass around the book in a little while, but this is a picture of Rita sitting here in her Sunday best at a Chagosian festival. You were born? Chagos, replied Rita Banku, before I could finish my question. In what year? 1928, the 30th of June. Rita grew up in one of Chagos's island groups, Paros, about 100 miles away from Diego Garcia. La même monnaie, la même mon reste, she added in the song-like up-and-down cadence of Chagosian's Creole. La même monnaie, la même mon reste. The island where I was born is the island where I stayed. And your parents, I asked? What island were your parents born on? My parents were born there too, Rita explained. My grandmother, the mother of my father, was born on 6 islands, Siciles. My father was also born in 6 islands. My grandfather was born there too. My grandmother on my mother's side was born in Paros. Rita does not know where her other ancestors were born, one of the injuries still carried by people with enslaved forebears. However, she remembers her grandmother, Olivette Pauline, saying that Rita's great-great-grandmother had been enslaved and had the name Masambo or Mazambo. Rita thinks she was a Malgas, a person from Madagascar. In fact, the Chagosians are the descendants of enslaved Africans and indentured Indians who began being brought to Chagos, to Diego Garcia and the other islands of the archipelago, beginning around the time of the American Revolution in the late 18th century. Franco-Mauritians brought the Chagosians, or their ancestors, to Chagos to work on and build coconut plantations on the islands. The islands had previously been uninhabited as far as anyone knows. And over time, over the next almost 200 years, the Chagosians, this diverse group of people, came to form a distinct and unique people with its own French and Bantu-based Creole language and distinct cultural and other traditions. By the 1960s, Mauritian Governor Robert Scott described Diego Garcia as having the look of a French coastal village, miraculously transferred whole to this shore. And it's important to point out that the islands and the lives they lived were far from luxurious. These were most definitely plantation societies. But over the 200 years in which they lived on the islands, they had struck what was, for a plantation society, a relatively good work bargain. There was universal employment, and in exchange for the labor, people had regular salaries in cash and food, as well as a range of social benefits, free education, health care. They had their own land, their own houses, and a range of other social benefits. On islands that, it should be pointed out, are described by many as idyllic. These are gorgeous tropical islands in the middle of the Indian Ocean. Rita put it this way: life there paid very little, a very little, Rita said, but it was the sweet life. That life began coming to an end, however, in the late 1950s when a man named Stuart Barber who was a civilian in the US Navy, was working in the Pentagon, living outside of Washington, D.C. in the Virginia suburbs, not far from where I live, actually.